Israeli airstrikes continue in the dark as hundreds of thousands of Palestinian civilians spend another anxious night in Gaza.
An Israeli soldier captured by Hamas militants returns to her family following her rescue, while relatives of hostages mount pressure on the government to help bring them home. Displaced Palestinian families find shelter and respite from the Israel-Hamas war in schools run by the United Nations in Gaza.
Israeli airstrikes continue in the dark as hundreds of thousands of Palestinian civilians spend another anxious night in Gaza. Israeli troops backed by tanks have expanded their operations inside Gaza, amid reports that IDF troops have cut off the key main north-south road near Gaza City, indicating Israeli forces may be trying to cut off Gaza City. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has ruled out a ceasefire in Gaza, declaring this is a time for war.
Calls for a ceasefire are calls for Israel to surrender to Hamas, to surrender to terrorism, to surrender to barbarism. That will not happen. Ladies and gentlemen, the Bible says that there is a time for peace and a time for war. This is a time for war.
Aid agencies are reporting that the humanitarian crisis in Gaza continues to worsen. There is insufficient water, food, medicine and fuel. The International Criminal Court's top prosecutor Karim Khan said impeding aid could constitute a war crime.
I want to underline clearly to Israel that there must be discernible efforts without further delay to make sure civilians receive basic food, medicine, anesthetics, morphine. We hear reports of operations taking place without these basic medicines, as if we're in the Middle Ages.
On October 7, Hamas attacks killed 1,400 Israelis and saw at least 239 people kidnapped as hostages. Hamas says more than 8,000 people have been killed since Israel's retaliatory bombing began.
A rare moment of celebration outside the home of an Israeli soldier, the first to be rescued during a ground operation in Gaza, led by Israel's defence forces and the Shin Bet intelligence. The rescue has been called a, quote, big success. Private Ori Megiddish is one of several soldiers to have been taken hostage by Hamas militants on the 7th of October. The details of her rescue remain secret. It's unclear whether any fighting was involved. Separately, Hamas has released a video of 3 female hostages. The women have been identified, but it's unclear when the footage was recorded. Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu has described the pictures as cruel, psychological propaganda. Meanwhile, the mother of a German-Israeli woman who was seized by Hamas says news that her daughter is now dead at least ends the unbearable uncertainty.
Sie war ein ganz lebensfrohes Mädchen und selbstständig, war eine Künstlerin, hat Musik und Tanzen geliebt und hatte ganz viele Freunde auf der ganzen Welt. Und sie war sehr mit Deutschland verbunden, hat auch Deutsch gelernt und hat viele Freunde gehabt. Ja, es ist einfach zu kurz. Das Leben ist viel zu kurz für so eine junge Frau.
Families of captives continue to put pressure on the Israeli government to make their rescue a priority. More than 200 empty beds representing those taken by the Hamas military wing were set up in front of the mayor's office in Jerusalem in a symbolic gesture of innocent people dragged from their homes. Under Israel's relentless bombardment in Gaza, UN-run schools like this one in Khan Younis have become a place of refuge and relief for thousands of families. The everyday lives of these children in the Palestinian territory have come to a grinding halt. Amid the destruction and chaos of war, agency workers here are trying to give the children a semblance of normality through fun and games.
كمان في جزئية مهمة جدا نحن نعرف الأطفال إنه لا يفهموا إلا لغة اللعب، حرموا من هذه الألعاب، حرموا من المدارس، حرموا من كل حقوقهم الإنسانية. حالات القصف الليلية وحالات المجازر الليلية هي جزء من عملية وجود نوع من أنواع الفزع والقلق والخوف اللي بتنتقل للأطفال.
في قطاع غزة معرض للخطورة في أي وقت. ممكن وأنا جاي للنشاط أكون معرض للخطورة، ولكن إحنا دورنا المجتمعي ودورنا كشباب فلسطيني مسلم إنه إحنا نقدم أنشطتنا ونخفف على أبناء شعبنا، وهذا الأمر بالنسبة لنا طبيعي وإحنا مستمرين في هذا العمل.
The sound of not-so-distant Israeli air raids have become the norm, but despite the risks posed, children here are finding moments of respite, playing with their friends.
أنا جيت عشان ألعب معاهم عشان أنسى الحرب وأنسى القصف الذي سمعناه في الدور في المدارس.
دار عمي انقصفت وكانوا فيها حدا اتصلوا علينا اليهود وقالوا أنا انبسطت كثير لأن اليوم لعبونا ولعبنا في المدرسة فرحنا.
There is no drinking water or food, which is the most basic human right. We can't sleep because of the strong sounds made by Israeli planes.
The Israeli-Hamas war has taken a devastating toll on the region's young. The UN estimates between 2,000 and 3,000 Palestinian youths have been killed in Israeli attacks, as well as 30 Israeli children in Hamas militant raids.
UN agencies have repeated their calls for a humanitarian ceasefire at an emergency UN Security Council meeting. Several agencies have reported to the Council, including UNICEF, which said that over 3,400 children had been killed since the retaliatory bombing by Israel following the October 7 Hamas attack. The Security Council is trying to agree on delivering at least a pause in the fighting to provide respite for desperate civilians. The Council said it would continue to focus on humanitarian efforts. Russian President Vladimir Putin has blamed the West and Ukraine for Sunday's unrest inside Russia after rioters in the mainly Muslim Dagestan region stormed an airport looking for Jewish passengers on a flight from Tel Aviv. Hundreds of angry men, some carrying banners with anti-Semitic slogans, rushed onto the tarmac of the airport in Makashkala. Putin has called on security services to protect what he called the inter-ethnic and inter-religious consent in the country.
The aftermath of a deadly blast that killed Reuters journalist Islam Abdullah and injured 6 others in southern Lebanon on the 13th of October. NGO Reporters Without Borders says the shots were fired from Israel's direction and claims this press vehicle and 7 journalists at the scene were deliberately targeted.
The location where the journalists were standing in Al-Mashab was explicitly targeted, not by 1, but by 2 strikes, 37 to 38 seconds apart, that come from the east, from the direction of the Israeli border. It was a targeted strike to the location where the journalists were standing.
RSF also says a journalist from a Lebanese network saw an Israeli military helicopter fly overhead seconds before the attack.
We said it clearly that we were attacked by by 2 Israeli rockets at that day. And this is very clear for us. This wasn't the first time. On October 9th also, we were attacked by an Israeli rocket.
While Prime Minister Netanyahu's military has not taken responsibility for the strike, RSF says Israel is looking to silence the media.
Targeting journalists is a war crime. There is no justification for targeting journalists who are covering a conflict zone.
According to the NGO, at least 12 journalists have been killed since the 7th of October, most of them in Gaza, where the war between Israel and Hamas started, while the Palestinian press syndicate has counted 33.
A lawmaker from the far-right Alternative for Germany party, Daniel Halemba, who was recently elected to the Bavarian state parliament, has been arrested. The 22-year-old is being investigated for incitement and the use of symbols of unconstitutional organizations. Under German law, it is illegal to display symbols such as Nazi swastikas. German MPs are usually granted immunity from prosecution. However, lawmakers are only covered from the start of the legislative period, which began after Halemba's arrest.
A €6 billion plan to double the size of the Western Balkan economies in the next 10 years. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen starts her trip to the region with a serious economic offer and a set of ambitious political requests. In Kosovo, she asked for a drastic de-escalation of the conflict among the Albanian majority and Serbian community.
And we've discussed the topic together that Kosovo could launch the procedure to establish the Association of Serb-Majority Municipalities. That is the draft statement of last week. Serbia should deliver on de facto recognition. What can we do to lift the measures.
The economic package promised by the European Commission to the Western Balkans has the appeal of an opportunity that can only happen once. There is a general mood in favor of enlarging the EU by 2030. It does mean, however, that the candidates will have to accept political conditions that some of their own population might find difficult to accept. The slowly disintegrating world order means that tough choices will have to be made.
In the North Macedonian capital, President von der Leyen asked the country's Prime Minister to amend the constitution and formally recognise the existence of the Bulgarian minority. Prime Minister Kovacevski will have to persuade the nationalist opposition, though.
Ние имаме неповторлива шанса да обезбедиме европска иднина за државата со носењето на потребните одлуки во собранието, европските интеграции и атлантските интеграции на државата конечно за прв пат во своето политичко постоење во парламентот ќе покажат дека се за европска иднина на државата.
Von der Leyen is also travelling to Serbia, Montenegro and Bosnia and Herzegovina as she tries to push their governments to pursue the reforms needed in view of their integration into the EU.
Fresh from issuing an executive order to moderate risks growing from increasingly powerful AI technology, President Joe Biden welcomed children at a Halloween Eve trick-or-treating at the White House. Grey skies and drizzle added to the spooky atmosphere, and books were as abundant as sweets at the event, jointly hosted with First Lady Jill Biden. Monday's Hallow Read event featured book giveaways and story readings. The First Lady said she was dressed as her cat Willow and was spotted wearing feline ears, a tail and a black nose.